Vampire Survivors is a game that I loved from the moment I started playing it. It was a fun action roguelike that had simple but fun gameplay. I've already reviewed the base game, and it easily became one of my favorite games. If you want to take a look at the base game, I'll link to that review in the video here and in the comments below. But what I'm talking about here isn't the base game, but the first DLC for Vampire Survivors, called Legacy of the Moonspell. I'm mainly wanting to ask two questions about the DLC. What does it add to the game, and do I think it is worth getting? Now, Legacy of the Moonspell costs $1.99, which isn't a lot, but it is almost half the cost of the base game. While this is a bit strange in some ways, it speaks more to the low cost of Vampire Survivors than the DLC being overpriced, in my opinion. So this leads us to ask, what does the DLC add to the game? The Legacy of the Moonspell adds a decent amount of content to Vampire Survivors. Looking at the store page, it claims to add a new stage, 8 new characters, 13 new weapons, and 6 new music tracks. So let's take a closer look at each of these categories. The new stage is called Mount Moonspell, and this is actually a pretty impressive map. Instead of a map that just kind of feels like a video game level with repeating textures and areas and things like that in it, Mount Moonspell actually feels more like a real location. It has a mountain with caves, a town, a lake, fields, and a larger compound. The only bad thing is that the details of the map don't really translate to your in-game map, and this can make navigation a bit tricky at times. Now, this isn't too bad, especially once you go through the map a few times and kind of get your bearings down, you kind of can navigate a little bit better. And it also seems like this might be an issue that the developer is planning to rectify by adding some more details onto the minimap. Since the lack of feeling like the maps were actual locations was one of my few critiques of the main game, it's really nice to see this change and have a level being a little bit more like a location than just some kind of random stage with a different background and some different details on the map. I should also note that this DLC does go in a bit of a different direction thematically from the original Vampire Survivors. Instead of a gothic Castlevania style, this leans more into Japanese mythology and folklore, with Eastern style buildings and Oni and yokai being a lot of the monsters found on the map. While I did enjoy the gothic Castlevania influence of the base game, I also really like that it's expanding and going in other directions as well, because it all kind of somehow fits together. It's all these kind of, monsters and myths, and so it all works, even though it is a very different kind of theme. Now, the game adds 8 new characters to the game. In reality, this is more like 6 new characters and 2 upgraded versions of those characters. Like, while these are technically 8 separate characters that you get to pick, it's a little bit misleading. Now, this is still pretty good, and the upgraded versions do have different bonuses and starting weapons than their unupgraded versions. They just have somewhat similar sprites. Now, you get a mix of interesting abilities in these new heroes. There's also ones that have kind of ones that are similar to the abilities in the base game, where it's just like adding a % to one of your stats after every level or every so many levels. But yeah, it's a good mix of kind of new inventive abilities, but also ones that don't stray too far from kind of some of the formulas in the base game. On the weapons front, saying there are 13 new weapons is slightly misleading. There are 7 new base weapons. 6 of these weapons have evolutions, so you can technically count that as a new weapon, but that really depends on whether you count evolutions as completely new weapons or simply upgraded versions of a weapon. Personally, I probably lean more on counting them simply as upgrades, but that could just be me. The weapons are all pretty fun though, and they are nice additions to your arsenal, and again, kind of blend well with the more Eastern mythology folklore focus instead of the kind of Castlevania theme. So they're kind of very thematically appropriate. There are also 6 new music tracks, 1 associated with the new location, and 5 that are associated with a certain character. The music from the base game was phenomenal and really fitting and a lot of fun to play the game to, and that continues with the DLC. It's still that same level of quality and enjoyability, and I really liked the music in the DLC just as much as I did the base game. So overall, I'd say that the DLC largely delivers on what it advertises. The most misleading is probably the weapons side of things, but you can also understand how they're getting their number. If you're familiar at all with Vampire Survivors, it shouldn't come as a surprise that some of these weapons are simply evolutions, even if it may stretch that kind of total number of new weapons in some ways. I've looked at what is in this DLC. Is Legacy of the Moonspell then worth adding to your Vampire Survivors experience? If you're a big fan of Vampire Survivors, which I would consider myself one, I would give this a resounding yes. It's not going to change the experience to make you start to like Vampire Survivors if you don't already, but it gives you more characters, more weapons, and a new stage to play. It does all this and only asks for $1.99, which is a pretty good deal for a decent amount of extra content. While you could argue that this is almost half the price of the base game for much less than half the content, I would reiterate what I did at the beginning of this video. I think this speaks more to how ridiculously low priced Vampire Survivors is than it does to being too high of a price for the DLC. All this to say that I would definitely recommend that you pick this up to add to your Vampire Survivors experience. I typically enjoy when my favorite games get more content, and this is no exception.